All right, guys, let's talk about ambient light rejection. So first off, the screen you're looking at, not ALR, okay? It is a Lambertian specular hybrid that was customized for this room and the time period and environment that my wife and I sit and watch, okay? Just got that on so that got something to look at while I'm talking here. All right, so ALR, everybody knows ALR is ambient light rejection. Now, I've read a lot of white papers on the information behind and the technology behind the ambient light rejection screens. That's a lot of the information and material that we went through, plus working with some optical folks to try to understand, what made these screens work. Now, from those, I look at ambient light rejection as a bit of a misnomer. Not that it matters, it's a matter of semantics, but I think what's really happened there and best describes what's happening is ambient light reflection or reflectivity. But we'll get to that in a second. So let's talk about ambient light rejection screens. Well, you have different types of screens. You have multi-layer composite screens that are ambient light rejection, and they work off one approach, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then you've got multi-layer composite screens that have microstructures in them. They work off the previous approach plus the inclusion of microstructures. And then you have sub-gain screens that aren't, they're multi-layer but not multi-layer in the same sense and not for the same reason, that utilize microstructures. You can think of those as more like the ultra short throw sawtooth screens, okay? So what are the things that are going on there? Now, one of the key things that I've heard a lot of people talking about or mentioning whenever they talk about ALR is material screens, okay? Material. So when we say material, what are we talking about? Are we talking about cotton or linen or no? We're not talking about those things, right? So the material that you're talking about typically, now there's still fiberglass screens, things like that, but what you're generally referring to are plastics. Those material screens are made from different types of plastics, PET, PVC, etc. So those plastics all start out as, guess what? A liquid, right? And then they're formed into the specific sheets that are needed for bonding for these folks to make ALR screens. And when I say these folks, there's really only about 2 or 3 major manufacturers out there. You've got some people who buy other screens from different manufacturers and then private label them, but for the most part, there's only a small number of people that make these screens. So, what are we talking about? You're talking about layers of plastics that are combined, bonded, generally through heat or something similar, but those are bonded as a filtration system for light management. And that's really what all of this comes down to, light management. How does a screen efficiently manage and control the light from the projector, okay? And then how does it manage and help control ambient light? And when they say ambient light, here's a key factor that people need to keep in mind. You're talking about off-axis ambient light. Light from the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. When you get a light source that's pretty close in proximity to your projector light, front facing, there's not an ALR screen made that's going to completely cover you, okay? It's going to take on that light. It's kind of a concept that we refer to as buildup here, where you get enough light in a room, you've got light bouncing all over, and while it may not be directionally pointed at the screen, you get enough light bouncing around in the room to where you do have a good bit more front-facing light. So whether that light is intentionally pointed at the screen or incidental in the sense of you have a dome light, say up in the center of the room, right? The screens, any ALR screen is only going to be able to handle so much of that. The dome light, if it's closer to the screen, it will probably manage it better. As you get back further away from the screen, it's going to be more front-facing in nature, so you're going to take that on. So these screens work based on the concept of managing light that's coming from off-axis angles, okay? So, important to know. And if you look at the websites for Screen Innovation, Stewart Screens, any of those screens, Daylight, Elite, they're going to refer to that, okay? And that's the reason, just again, if you think about Elite CLR and CLR2, those are ceiling light rejection. So it manages the light from above for UST screens. So it's all about the off-axis lighting. So where does Partay come into this? Well, a couple of years ago, we had started trying to recreate those multi-layer screens using different types of polymers in multiple layer sequences. Okay, think of it as you have one diffusion layer, you have a gain layer, you have filtration layers, which either are going to colorize or transmit, diffuse your light. Once again, it's all about light management. And when we make those, we spray those plastics in layers, specific layers. They have to be in a specific sequence to work correctly. And it's a different sequence for the darker screens than it is for the lighter screens. For the lighter screens, it only takes 5 layers. For the darker screens, you're looking at 7. For us, for the way that we make the screens here. Now, that was our Diamante line. So those who have been around for a while, you'll remember that that was a big deal for us, that we publicized that we had created basically a multi-layer composite screen through a spray techniques. And those still exist. They still exist today. As a matter of fact, this screen here will be replaced with either Vega Plus. I haven't made up my mind yet, but it's going to be a multi-layer composite Diamante style screen. When we decided to take that and move it to a single coat, or not a single coat, a single formula that you can sell, it was very difficult. It was challenging. As a matter of fact, let me back up, even on the multi-layer screens. And I'm going to tell you how those work in just a second, but even with the multi-layer screens, when we discovered it, we were all happy, went out, had dinner that night, celebrated, and then just a few days later, I went to recreate it and lost it. Completely lost it. Now, it was a mistake on my part. It was something I didn't document correctly. But it took me over 2 months to recreate it again. And by that time, I had enough notes to make sure that it never happened again. But essentially, guys, these screens work off one concept. It's really 2 concepts, but the primary concept that helps Partay screens do what they do is the concept of transmission. 2 or 3 actually about refraction, saying that they've, is it about refraction? It's not really about refraction. Refraction's more about light hitting transparent mediums of different densities that then slow down the light, bend it, that kind of thing, right? Then you can kind of see that, like if you put your hand in the pool, your hand looks like it's just a little off from your wrist. That's refraction. Okay, those kind of things. But that's really more through transparent mediums of different density, like say glass is going to be much more dense than water. So that's not really what happens here. I'm not saying there's no refraction whatsoever, but it would be so incidental as to be nominal. The concept that these screens work off of is transmission. Okay, and the multi-layered made it easier to build a transmission screen. Those transmission screens, what they do is the light, if you think about your lampshade, you see light come through your lampshade. It's the same concept here, just a lot more delicate. But what you're essentially trying to do is let light into the screen and back out of the screen. And it's going to be filtered in the sense that you're going to have light that comes through. It's going to go through different layers where it's going to be diffused, and then it's going to be increased in gain, and then it's going to be diffused again, and then it's going to be increased in gain. And it's going to happen on the way in and to some degree on the way out. And that is the concept that manufactured screens work off of from an ALR perspective. The microstructures that are added in are enhancements to light management. What does that mean? Well, see, the thing is whenever you're dealing with a transmission screen, you have to balance the roll-off because your projector light doesn't come straight in. It comes out at an angle, right? And those reflections are going to come out at a complete counter angle. So if you make it too bright, too transmissive, you get what's called roll-off, or we refer to roll-off, which is it's going to get darker on the sides. Be brighter in the center, and then it's going to progressively get darker on the sides. So you have to manage that. And you manage that through diffusion. So the transmission at that point is going to provide an extra level of brightness enhancement just because you have additional things going on in the screen that create, basically it's like creating light within the screen and almost retaining it a little better than something that just kind of hits it and goes direct. Think of the concept of, say, a white, the names elude me right now, so apologies guys, but when you think about Shears on a window, it's sort of the same thing, right? If you have direct light, you've got a hard level of light that's coming in. If you put a shear on there, it sort of diffuses the light out and about, so you brighten up more of the room. Not as much as the direct light does where it hits, but it diffuses the light more evenly across the room, so you get an appearance of it being brighter in a lot of areas that would look dark because of the contrast between direct light and, say, the wall. So the concept here applies. Now, in the complication was taking that from multi-layer down to a single formula. And to do that, we had to look at how you could overlap areas of transmission in your roll. And the roll was important because spray's easy, spray's multi-layer. You notice that we said in our displays that you need to do at least 4 layers. If you can do a 5th one, that's great. But in those layers, okay, essentially what's happening is that you're capturing some of the light, letting the rest of the light pass through into other layers behind it. And your ambient light that's coming in from the side is going to hit the surface, okay, and it's going to reflect off. Up until a certain point, it's only going to hit the first layer, maybe the second layer, and then it's going to bounce out. You'll notice a small impact as light builds up, but the ambient light screens, the formulas, will actually hold up very, very well because you've got multiple layers in there, and the back layers are not as impacted. And one way that, I'll just kind of throw this out there. Phantom HD Illuminate said something. He actually cited 2 things that are very key. And I'm not trying to put him on the chopping block for anything, so Phantom, not that. But you said 2 things that were really key. You said, 1, if you painted over a white surface, it was brighter, right? Once again, transmission. If you painted over a black surface, and we've told you this in the past, if you wanted more contrast, paint it over a black surface. Okay, transmission. Because more of that light's going to be absorbed on your back layer. So it's going to provide a little bit of a contrast lift. Won't be as bright as if you paint it over a white, but sometimes that's not really what people are going for. They think so, but that's not really what they're going for. So that was one key thing, but there was also another key thing. He said you want to paint it over a smooth surface, because when you paint it over a bumpy surface, you notice it. And once again, due to transmission. See, for those who have seen it, now we've sold, since we came out with the new formulas, we've sold roughly about 40 different containers of it, and then we sent some out for review. But for those people who have seen it, especially the ones who reviewed it, there's one concept that I think all of you could probably agree with. When you look at the Partay product, it almost appears as if the image is coming from the back of the screen, not from the surface. And that's the differentiation between Partay and paint mixes. Because a paint mix, even though you have some degree of transmission that always happens in paint, it's never going to be able to provide you enough. Even if you use pearlized things to put it in there, because a lot of people, their mind goes straight to, well, it's all about transparency. No, it's not. Transparency can be your enemy as much as it can be your friend. It's all about balance. Balanced reflectivity, balanced diffusion, balanced absorption. It's about balancing all of those aspects out in the screen, as well as it being able to be applied in a manner that doesn't really work against you. And here, let me explain that real quick. So I know that some folks were talking about refraction and, you know, about things, you know, in suspension. So here's the thing. We use proprietary solids. We had to. Now, our Diamante lineup, the multi-layered screens, use no reflective solids whatsoever. There's no mica, no metallic, no nothing like that in them, okay? But we had to do that in the Goppity Goop lineup because you're trying to get one formula to do all that those layers were doing. It's not going to be as efficient as the multi-layered screens, but it still works. What we had to do is we basically use that are utilized to provide random brightness. When you say random brightness, well, it's because all of these are irregular shapes. They're very small. You're talking super, super, super small pieces of reflective solids, but they're all irregular shapes. And along with that, there's some mica that we use in there, but it's not your cosmetic grade mica that we've shown in the past. We can't use that. The reason why is because it contains tint. So we can't use it. We have to use raw mica ground. So all of those components are put in there to randomize the brightness within the screen, okay, within the transmission layers. And the difficulty is once again, you could roll multiple layers, and what you're doing is you're just kind of, you're trying to pull all the aspects of a multi-layered screen and balance it out into, you know, a single layer, but then do it multiple times so that you're going through multiple layers and holding some of that transmission in the back. With a single formula, the difficulty was really in rolling. Why? Because when you roll these things, what you're essentially doing is laying any, like if you use metallic silver or something like that, all you're doing is laying those pieces of metal down flat and they become mirror-like. And so it's going to be too specular and it's going to hotspot. Just very simple. Unless you diffuse the heck out of it, it's going to hotspot. And the more that you diffuse the outer layer, you just turn the screen back to a Lambertian screen. Because that outside diffusion layer, if it's not set appropriately, what's going to happen? And I'm not talking, because people go to matte, satin, and all those kind of things. We're talking about fractions of those levels of enhancement, whether it's, you know, somewhere between a matte and satin. You could have 20 different shades between a matte and a satin. So if you use like a satin poly or a matte poly, even a matte poly is too bright. It really is. It's too bright. It's too diffusive and also too bright. So you have to find ways that you can essentially get the surface that you want while capturing some of the light within the surface through absorption, transmission, those things, because there's a level of all of it going on. But that's as much as I'm going to say about the ALR nature of these screens. One, they're plastic based. You're creating multiple layers. That's the reason we call it an optical coating, not a paint mix, because there's no paint in it. None. Paint is not a bad thing, guys. I've always said that in lower light environments, paints will actually serve people really well. Once you start getting above 60, you know, around the 60 to 100 lux mark, paint's going to fail you. Even the darker ones, they may look better, they may hold up a black background longer, but they're still going to fail you. Why? They're going to fail you because when you illuminate the surface of a paint, it's going to make that surface lighter, which means that your projection image is going to be lighter. A lot of people don't even understand why screens wash out. They think it's the ambient light washing out the projector light. That is not the case. It's because you're illuminating when you have light that's actually hitting the screen from off-axis directions or, front facing. It's going to illuminate the color of the screen, and it's going to make that color of the screen way lighter. And now you're trying to get a contrast off a much lighter screen. So that's the reason we've always said the battle happens at the surface. We're taking the battle into the screen, not on the surface. And here's the thing. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about acrylics or, whatever kind of paints that you're talking about. As a matter of fact, some of your premium paints would be the worst. But when you're talking about paints, paint is designed to do a specific thing. It's designed to colorize a surface opaquely. So the components that are in paint will always limit you from achieving the level of transmission that you need. And then when you get into different plastics, now you got to find things that play well together. Copolymers that you can build, right? That do the things you want them to do. You want them to be pliable or flexible, right? So that's one thing that you want to do. And now that came in with our Proflex line. So anybody who's not seen any videos around our Proflex line, go back and look at those videos. Because we came out with Diamante, then we came out with Gobbledygook, which was a less efficient, and we stated that, a less efficient means of ALR than our multi-layer screens, but still ALR. Right now, roughly, we figure they block somewhere in, or skate off, anywhere between 40 to 42% of off-axis light. But I go back to, and because here's the thing, you say, can you prove it? Well, you can prove it by looking at the screen. Once again, those folks who have seen it, correct me if I'm lying. When you look at the screen, you get the sense that the image is not coming from the surface. And why do you get that? Because it's not. Now, on a screen like this, the image is coming primarily from the surface, and that's the reason you see in those high contrast areas that it's more gray than black. For example, right here, you still get the concept of contrast, but as dark as that screen is, it should be darker in those areas. But the light's washing across the surface. It doesn't have anything within the screen to help it. From an ALR perspective, our other screens, our new formulas, do. And the light is being projected from within through multiple layers. So when your surface hits, and I'll give you a quick example here. I apologize because I haven't had a chance to get myself set up today, cleaned up. But hold on. There's an example right there. And you can see the light that's hitting it. Now that screen is just a little bit darker than the Vega. That's the Vega Plus. You can see how the light does not impact it. Pretty much par on par for color with the Vega, right? So even though this Vega Plus is pretty close in color to the Vega, but you notice that the darks are going to hold out a lot longer. Your colors are a little richer, and primarily all because the light is not impacting the surface as it is with the other. You can see that the Vega there, let me back out a little bit, but you can see that the Vega there, while Looks great in bright areas whenever you have, there you go. So you can see the coloration is pretty close. The lemons are just as yellow within the Vega Plus, but your background's going to hold up, and that's because most of your image is not at the surface. And what is, even though the light hits it, it's not going to impact it anywhere near as much. So that is the ALR. If folks want to see something that's more like in the form of, you know, our roll-off graphs, our transmission graphs, I mean, I'll be happy to do another little video where we just kind of walk through what that is, what it does. But there's a direct difference right there between Lambertian, ALR. Lambertian, ALR. All right. Hopefully that answers any questions out there, because once again, you got to remember those material screens come from somewhere, and they all start out as a liquid. What happens to them after there is all proprietary, and it's going to stay that way with us too. But they all start out as a liquid, guys. It's just a matter of how do you treat them after that. You know, I don't have the quality assurance to be able to build sheets. I don't have the tooling to build sheets, so we have to do it through spray techniques. But it gets you there. Not as efficiently. You know, you have some screens out there that are anywhere between 65 to, you know, some of the Black Diamond stuff is 90 plus, you know, % light efficiency as far as how they handle off-axis light. We're not as efficient as that, not yet. We're working on ALR structures now. Think we've got a good beat on it, and think we're going to be able to provide those in our screens that we sell in 2022. Found actually a way that's kind of not that difficult. Less difficult than we thought, because we'd been looking at 3D printing and things like that, and it was just going to be a pain in the butt, because you would have to have different designs for different size screens for the microstructures to actually work correctly. But we think that we found a much more logical approach. Not quite as efficient as, say, like heavy microstructure design would be, but doesn't matter. It's still going to do what we need it to do. So, direct example, not paints. Not knocking paint, guys. Paints are inexpensive and very nice ways to handle, you know, projector light in lower light environments if you don't have a lot of ambient light. And I know a lot of people say, well, who watches in that kind of light? Well, you'd be surprised. We wouldn't even be out here if it wasn't for people who are looking to watch in that level of light. And then you got folks that they can't do anything about it. They could, but who wants to work in a dark room, right? So if they're wanting to watch something, or they're using their, because I use mine, used to use it as a bit of a monitor. I don't do that anymore, because most of the work that I've been involved with really doesn't accommodate that. But there are people who use their screens for a lot of different purposes. They use it in different ways, and they have light that comes through banks of windows that they need help overcoming. And yay, that's where Partay sticks in. All right. So hopefully that answers questions. If you got any specific questions, feel free to direct them. I'll try to answer them as best as I can without giving away the farm. But we'll be happy to try to answer any of those questions for you. You guys take care. We'll talk soon. Bye.